Hi everyone! Today we're going to knit the gauge swatch for the Bikini Slipover together. This tutorial is meant to be a gauge swatch tutorial while also showing you how to knit Intarsia, so you can practice your Intarsia skills while also making the swatch for the Bikini Slipover. As with all our patterns, we are going to have a full video tutorial for the Bikini Slipover. However, I would really recommend you guys to do a gauge swatch first for this pattern. Not only is it helpful to see if your meat gauge and if everything is correct in terms of your stitches and your stitch tightness, but also it helps you to practice your Intarsia skills a little bit beforehand if you're not that advanced at Intarsia already. I quickly want to talk about what a gauge swatch actually is. Before you start knitting any garment, you're always going to make a gauge swatch, and that's what we're going to do together today. A gauge swatch is basically a small sample of your knitting, and it helps you see if you like how your stitches look and whether they're too tight or too loose. Most importantly, it helps you make sure your final project will have the right size. Gauge is always measured within a 10 by 10 centimeter window or 4 by 4 inches. In that window, you will check two things. One is how many stitches fit across horizontally. So basically count the stitches you can see within this 10 centimeter window here. And the second thing is how many stitches you can fit vertically. So basically how many rows you've made within this 10 centimeter window. One thing I really want to mention here is that it's important to block your swatch before you can measure anything. Blocking in general means wetting and drying the yarn, so putting this swatch in water and letting it dry, just like you would normally do with your finished slipover. This helps that your stitches can settle the way they normally would after wearing and washing, and this kind of mimics what you would normally do with your slipover. For the Bikini Slipover, the correct gauge is 22 stitches and 33 rows in a 10 by 10 centimeter square. If you find your stitches are too tight, meaning that you have more stitches than needed, simply go up one size. If your stitches are too loose, meaning you have fewer stitches than you would need, go down a needle size. For me, for example, I use a 3.5 millimeter needle, whereas Lottie is a tighter knitter, and she goes up to 3.75 or even 4 sometimes. And to make it a little bit easier, we're going to make our swatch a little bit bigger, since this is going to help us count the rows and the stitches a lot easier at the end, since you can kind of already see that sometimes the side starts to curl in on itself, especially with stockinette stitch. For me here, for this tutorial, I will also add this little garter stitch border. This helps the swatch to lay better flat and helps me also count my rows in the end. But I'm going to show you how to do this exactly in the tutorial. Now let's talk about the chart we'll be using for our swatch today. A chart is basically a picture translated into stitches. Each little square represents one stitch. So each of these squares here is one stitch. A knit stitch when it's on the right side and a purl stitch when you're on the wrong side. This is what we will be using today. You can see our bow design here, which you can also see translated into our swatch. And we have this gray kind of border around here. And this just represents our garter stitch border that we're going to make around our swatch. Just to not forget this. In the end, I marked it in gray. You can find and download this chart in our video description, but it's also going to be part of our pattern, so you can also find it within your download there. In this chart, for you it should probably be pink, for me it's purple. Don't ask me why my printer printed it purple. But each of these colorful squares here is knitted in the color of your bow, as you can see here in red. And all the other squares, even the gray ones here, are knitted in the contrast color you will be using. For me, this was blue here. Like I said before, I'm going to do this garter stitch border all around so that my swatch can lay down really nice and flat. If you want to skip this extra step, you can always do that. Just do regular stockinette all across. So knit the whole row and purl the whole row back. We did this with this swatch here and it works just the same. I just really like the way that this looks, and I don't really like how these edges are curling in on themselves. We had to force this down quite a little bit with our steam iron, but it still works. You can still use it. And if you want to skip this extra step with the garter stitch on the side, you can always do that. Let's quickly talk about what you're going to need for this swatch. Of course, you're going to need your chart. You can either print this out or open it on your laptop or your smartphone if you want. Then you're going to need 2 different colors of yarn, and both of these yarns should be the same type of yarn. I am going to be using red for my main color and then pink for the bow color. If you really want to make use of this swatch for your bikini slipover, then we would recommend to use the same needle and the same yarn that is recommended in the pattern. So for the pattern, we have a 3.5mm needle, and we have merino, which is 50 grams for 120 meters. In 2 different colors, of course. For me, today I'm going to be using this alpaca yarn, which is 50 grams, 110 meters, and a 3.5mm needle. But if you just want to practice Intarsia a little bit, you can use any scrap yarn that you like and also use any needle size that you like. Please feel free to always do that. You don't have to make the bikini slipover if you just want to practice a little bit. Furthermore, you're going to need a yarn needle, then you're going to need a scissor, a tape measure or a ruler to count your stitches in the end. You're going to need a marker or a pen and also some pins for blocking later on. Alright, so let's talk about Intarsia. I know it sounds super complicated at first, but trust me, it's really not as scary as it sounds once you get the hang of it. In Intarsia, you're basically working with multiple different strands of yarn at the same time. You're not carrying the yarn across large sections of your knitting like you would with stranded knitting, but instead you're using new strands every time you need a new color or you start a new section. A good rule of thumb is if you have to skip more than 4 stitches to reach the next section in the same color, you don't drag the yarn over, but instead you use a new piece of yarn. To keep everything a bit more organized and to avoid the yarn tangling, you can use little bobbins like I did here. This is just basically balls of yarn rolled up. They are super helpful when you have larger color sections like the bikini cups, but for smaller parts like this little bow here or the bow we have in the pattern, you can just totally work with longer loose strands instead that you don't have to roll up into bobbins, but instead just use a long piece of string. In Intarsia knitting, you always carry the yarn row by row and you connect the colors as you work your way up. For our bow, we start with a bobbin on each end of the bow, so one here and one here. Then we're going to work our way up. We're going to use a new bobbin here. And then for this bow section, it gets a little bit more complicated, but we're still going to manage. We are going to use one bobbin here, one here, one here, and one here. This will give us the nicest overall look and will help you practice carrying multiple strands of yarn at the same time. One thing I do want to mention is the difficulty level of this chart right here and the difficulty level of our bikini slipover. If you manage to knit this chart, you are going to be a pro at knitting the bikini slipover. In the bikini slipover, especially with the cups, you have very large sections of color that you work at the same time, so you don't have to switch colors and work with that many bobbins at the same time, which is super great. And the more difficult part in the pattern is the bow. But to be honest, this bow right here, where you have this small section where you have to carry a lot of colors, is more difficult, in my opinion, than the bow we have in the pattern. All right, now it's finally time to cast on our swatch. We are going to cast on 28 stitches to get the whole length for our swatch. So I'm just going to use a regular long tail cast on. And I'm going to cast on 28 stitches. This is what it's going to look like once you've cast on all your stitches. And now we are going to turn our work around and work the first row. For our first row, we have it marked in gray completely, so that means we are going to knit this entire row. For all of the stitches that are marked gray in this chart, we are always going to knit these stitches. So this is just in terms of knit and purl. And these ones here are just in terms of color. In general, you are going to work the right side with knit stitches and the wrong side with purl stitches, except for when you have these gray stitches marked here, you are always going to knit these stitches. So for our first row, we are going to do a row of completely knit stitches. I'm going to go ahead and knit all 28 of my stitches on the needle. This is what it's going to look like once you've completed your first row with all knit stitches. And now, since the second row is also marked in gray, we are going to turn our work again and knit the second row with all knit stitches. So I'm just going to go ahead and knit all 28 stitches on my needle for the second row. This is what it's going to look like once you've finished the second row. Now we are going to turn around again, and this time we're going to start with the right side and knit stitches. So that means we are going to do another row of knit stitches. Here you can see in row 3, we are going to start in white, and this is going to be the right side of our project. I am once again going to knit the entire row. Here is my row 3 complete, and now on the wrong side we are going to start with our first purl row here in row 4. For our purl row, it's important to remember that we are always going to do 2 knit stitches at the beginning of every purl row. For the right sides where we do the whole row in knit stitches, it doesn't really matter, or you don't really have to think about it, because you're going to do 2 knit stitches at the beginning and at the end of the swatch anyway. But for the purl rows, you have to remember, in order to create this border, you need to make 2 knit stitches at the beginning and 2 knit stitches in the end, and in between you are going to purl the row as normal. We are going to start our wrong side purl row with 2 knit stitches now. So this is the first, and this is the second knit stitch, and then we are going to switch to the purl stitch and purl until the last 2 stitches on the needle. Here I have my last 2 stitches of the row left, and we are once again going to knit these 2 stitches. 1 and 2. And with that we have row 4 complete. Now we are going to knit 2 more rows, 1 knit row and 1 purl row, until we are able to start with our Intarsia. And I'm going to see you once I finish these 2 additional rows. This is what it's going to look like once you finished your first 6 rows. With these 2 knit rows in the beginning, we've created this really nice border. And also at the ends of the swatch, we have this nice border that we are creating with the knit stitches as well. Now it's time to incorporate our Intarsia design. For that we are going to need 2 bobbins or long pieces of string in my case, and I'm going to start and see where the stitches start that I want to knit in a different color. For me here this would be 4 stitches until I start with a different color. But since we are going to pick up a new color and haven't used it before, we first have to incorporate it into our stitches. On the right side in row 7, you are just going to knit the first 3 stitches. Alright, so here I stopped 1 stitch before I want to join my actual new color, or before I want to use my new color. And this is because since I'm going to join a new piece of yarn, I want to secure it a little bit and incorporate it into my stitch so it sits a little bit tighter. And for that, you are going to take the end of your new piece of yarn and lay it over the yarn that you are currently working with. Then you're just going to knit the stitch as you would normally in the red or in the main color that you're using. And while you do this, you're simultaneously trapping the yarn in your stitch. And this is going to help you secure the yarn. But before we can start working with our new color, I want to wrap the new color, so pink in my case, once around the red one in order to create a tighter bond and to avoid any gaps in the future. So I'm just going to take my yarn, which is coming from behind, wrap it from below around the red one and go once around it. And there you have twisted your yarn once around the red one, and you can now start to work with the pink yarn. So you're going to take your pink yarn. You may have to hold the red one a little bit to the side so it's not in the way. And then you can make a knit stitch with the pink yarn. And since we have to do two, I'm going to also make the next one in pink. Now that we are done with our 2 stitches with the pink yarn, we are simply going to drop this yarn to the side. And from behind, we are going to bring up the main color. And while doing this, you are also going to lay the main color over the color you just used and therefore enclose it into your next stitch. So you're going to take up the next color, which for me here is red. Lay it over the pink yarn, so the pink yarn is underneath, and then you're simply just going to knit the next stitch. I would recommend to make this stitch a little bit tighter to avoid any gaps in between these 2 color changes. Now we're just going to knit 15 stitches in total with this one that we just made. Here I have done 15 stitches after the last 2 pink stitches that we did, and I stopped 1 stitch before we want to use our color again, these 2 stitches here. I stopped 1 stitch before to join in a new piece of yarn since we are going to use a different piece of yarn for this part of the bow right here. Once again, I'm going to lay the end of my new piece of yarn over the yarn that I'm currently working with to enclose it into our stitch and secure it. And I'm going to do a regular knit stitch and enclose my yarn in the back. The next stitch is going to be a pink stitch, and for that, to avoid any gaps, we are going to twist the yarn that's coming from below the red yarn once around to avoid having any holes later on. And work a regular knit stitch with the pink color. And since we have to do 2, I'm going to make a second one. Here I have my 2 stitches, and now I'm going to drop the pink yarn again, and I'm going to lay the red yarn over my pink yarn so that the pink yarn is underneath, and I'm going to continue with my regular stitches. This is what it's going to look like once you've finished row 7 from the front. So this is the right side. Here you have joined in your first ball of yarn, and here is the second one. And now we are going to turn to the wrong side and purl the row. Here we are on the wrong side, but remember we still have to make the first 2 stitches knit stitches to create our border. So I'm going to knit the first stitches in the purl row. And now I'm going to start purling, and then you can take a look at your chart and see how many stitches you need to purl to reach where you need to make stitches with your new color. So for me, those are 3 stitches that I now have to purl. So I'm going to purl 3 stitches, and also the pink stitch here, and it doesn't matter, you just purl it as normal. And then for the next stitch, you are going to do a pink stitch again. So that means you're going to drop the yarn, and then you're going to bring the new yarn over the old one. Same as we did on the front side, we are always going to lay the new yarn over the old yarn to entrap it into the next stitch to avoid any gaps. So right now I'm going to purl 2 stitches right here in pink. And then I'm going to once again drop the yarn, and from beneath I'm going to bring up the new piece of yarn, so the red one for me, to entrap my yarn once again. And I'm going to purl further until the next stitches that I have to make in pink. Here I did 14 more purl stitches in red, and now I want to start using my pink yarn again and do 2 stitches in pink, which means I am going to drop my red yarn off to the side, and then I'm going to search for my pink yarn. Sometimes it can get a little bit tricky to know which yarn is where, but most of the time you can see pretty clearly where your yarn is coming from, where you want to use it. So for me, this yarn here, and I'm going to lay it over the red yarn that I just used, since this is the new color I want to use. And now I'm going to purl this stitch. And then I'm going to purl a second one in pink. Now I want to switch back to red, so I'm going to drop the pink yarn and bring the red yarn over the pink yarn. And then I'm going to continue purling the row until the end, until the last 2 stitches, where I'm going to do 2 knit stitches. If you want, you can also start marking where you already did your stitches so you don't get confused and you know which row you're currently on. Now I am back on the right side and I'm going to knit 6 stitches until I want to do stitches in pink again. In the next 2 stitches, we are going to do 2 pink stitches. For that, I'm once again going to drop my yarn and pick up the new color that I want to work with and lay it over the yarn that I just worked with. Now I'm going to knit 2 stitches, and you can pull these stitches a little bit tighter to avoid any gaps. And then I'm going to switch back to red, so I'm going to drop my pink yarn and bring the red yarn over my pink yarn. And we are always going to do this to avoid having any gaps in between our stitches and color changes. I am going to continue knitting 12 stitches until I want to do 2 pink stitches again. All right, so here I did 12 stitches and now I want to do 2 stitches in pink again. And for that, I'm going to drop the red yarn and then look for the string of yarn that's on this side. I'm going to lay this new piece of yarn over the old color that I just used. And then I'm going to do 2 knit stitches with this new color. Now that I've finished working with my pink yarn, I'm going to let it drop again. And then I'm going to pick up the red yarn from beneath and lay it over the pink yarn. And then I'm going to finish the row knitting all stitches. This is what your swatch in row 9 is going to look like so far. We kind of can see that we used our yarn here in different spots and you just drag it over to where you need it. And this is completely normal. I just wanted to mention this quickly, that you don't have to worry that if the stitch is not directly above the stitch that you did before in the same color, it's not gonna be a problem. As long as you make your stitches a little bit tighter where you do the color changes, you shouldn't have any problems. Now we are simply going to work our way up the swatch every row. And please remember that on the purl rows, you're going to do the first 2 and last 2 stitches as knit stitches, and the rest you're going to purl. And you're always going to follow this chart. And we are going to meet again once you finish row 20. And I'm going to show you what to do with this big chunk here. I quickly wanted to mention again that you have to remember that you're always going to bring the new yarn over the old yarn that you just worked with when you do a color switch. This will make sure that you don't have any big gaps in between your color switches. Additionally, if you make your stitches a little bit tighter, you will also have a little smoother transition between your colors. So now we are just going to work our way up, and I'll see you again when you finish row 20. This is what your swatch should be looking like once you finish row 20, which is a wrong side row. This is the front, and this is the swatch from the back. And now we are going to join in a new piece of yarn for this large section right here in row 21. We are also going to forget about the yarn that we had right here, and we are just going to use this new piece of yarn that we are going to join in for this large section for 2 rows. Now we are going to knit 5 stitches, so we are going to stop 1 stitch before we are going to start with the pink yarn again to join in our new ball of yarn. So I'm going to start and knit 5 stitches in my main color. Now I have knit my 5 stitches, and then I'm going to take the end piece of yarn and lay it over the red yarn that I was currently using. And then I'm just going to knit a regular stitch and entrap my yarn. Now that we've joined in the pink yarn here in our last stitch, we have to now twist our pink yarn once again around the red yarn to avoid having any gaps. So I'm going to take the pink yarn that's underneath the red yarn and bring it once around my red yarn. Then I'm going to drop the red yarn, take the pink yarn, and then I can start knitting with my pink yarn. In total, I'm now going to knit 16 stitches with the pink yarn that I just joined. Here I've just knit 15 stitches, and I stopped 1 stitch before we will change back to the red yarn. But since we just made so many stitches and we cannot carry our red yarn over that many stitches, remember our rule of thumb is maximum of 4 stitches that we can carry our yarn. We now have to join in red yarn for this end piece here, and we're only really going to use this for this row and the next row. So I'm going to take my end piece of the red yarn that I'm going to join in, lay it over the pink yarn, and then I'm going to do 1 more stitch to complete my 16 stitches in pink. Then I'm going to once again twist my red yarn that I just joined in around the pink yarn to secure it. And now I can knit the rest of the stitches in the row. This is what our row 21 is looking like right now. So we joined in a new piece of pink yarn here and a new piece of red yarn here. And now we are going to turn to the wrong side and purl the row. One thing I quickly want to mention, because I'm seeing it right here, is that my yarn here is pretty tangled, but because I only have very short pieces of yarn, I can just pull them through and lay them in the order that I'm going to knit them in, and make sure that they are all separated and out of the way if I don't need them right now. We are going to start once again with 2 knit stitches to create our border. And then we are going to do 3 purl stitches until we are going to start again with the pink yarn. Here I'm going to drop the red yarn, and then I'm going to take up my pink yarn and lay it over the red yarn to enclose it. And now I'm going to do all of my pink stitches. Here I did my last pink stitch. Now I'm going to drop the pink yarn, and then I'm going to take my red yarn that is on this side, and I'm going to lay it over the pink yarn, and then I'm going to continue until the end of the row. All right, now that that's done, we can start with row 23. Here for this part, we are still going to use the pink yarn that we had from this longer section here. For the middle part here, we have to take up a new piece of yarn, same as for this part here that starts. We have to take up a new piece of yarn, and then we are going to carry our red main yarn all the way across. So the yarn that we joined in here, that we used for these 2 rows, we are not going to touch again. This yarn was just for these 2 rows where we couldn't carry our main red yarn all the way across. But now, since these are only 2 stitches each, we can carry it all the way across until the end. We have a lot of ends flying around at the back of our swatch, and if you want and they are bothering you, you can already start weaving in a few of these ends at the back. For example, you can weave in these ones right here that we are not going to use anymore. We are going to start row 22 by knitting 5 stitches in red. So I'm just going to knit 5 stitches right here. Then I have to knit 2 stitches in pink, and I'm going to use the yarn that we used for the larger section right here, and I'm going to continue knitting with this one. So I'm going to take it up, lay it over my red yarn, and then I'm going to do 2 knit stitches in pink. Then I'm going to switch back to the red, and I'm going to carry this now from the stitches that we did in the beginning. So the red is still going to be the same as we used before at the beginning of our row. Now I'm going to do 6 stitches in red and stop 1 stitch before we have to do 2 stitches in pink, because we are going to once again join in a new piece of yarn in pink. Right here we stopped, and we are going to put in a new piece of yarn. So I'm going to lay this over the red yarn that I'm working with, and I'm going to knit 1 more stitch in red to complete the 6 stitches that we have to knit. And then don't forget, we have to twist the new yarn around the old one. So I'm going to I have to untangle my ends a little bit. I am going to take my pink yarn and bring it once around the red yarn. And then I can start knitting 2 stitches with my newly joined pink yarn. Then I will let my pink yarn drop and lay the red that we are still continuing to work with over my pink yarn. And I'm going to knit 5 more stitches. And then we are going to join in a new piece of yarn. And this piece of yarn is for the end section right here. So here I'm going to join in a new piece of yarn, and I'm going to knit 1 more stitch in red, and then I once again twist my newly joined yarn around the old yarn to secure it, and then I can continue knitting with my pink yarn that I just joined. And I'm going to make 2 stitches here. Then I'm going to drop the pink yarn and lay the red yarn over it, and then I'm going to continue working with the red yarn. This is what our swatch is going to look like right now. So we have carried over the old yarn from the longer section right here for these 2 stitches. We joined new yarn for the middle, and we also joined new yarn right here on the side. Now we are going to do 2 more rows, and then we have to join in another piece of yarn for this middle section right here. So we'll just continue for 2 more rows, and then I'll see you again when we join the new yarn. All right, so I just finished row 25, and now we are going to turn this around and purl this row on the wrong side. And we are also going to join in a new piece of yarn. As always, we are going to knit the first 2 stitches on the wrong side. And then I'm going to purl 2 stitches. Then I will drop my yarn to the side, pick up the new pink color and make one stitch with the pink color. Then I drop the pink again, lay the red over top. Then I'm going to make 7 stitches in red. And then I'm going to lay my red yarn down again. And I'm going to use the pink yarn from underneath. And I'm going to make 1 stitch in pink. Then I'm going to drop the pink yarn, lay the red yarn on top. And I'm going to make 1 stitch in red. And now I'm going to take new yarn. So I'm going to take the end of a new piece of yarn and lay it over the red yarn that I just used. Going to pick up my red yarn again and have my pink yarn included here. And then I'm going to make another stitch in red. And now I have my new piece of yarn joined. And then I can drop my red yarn, take up the new piece of yarn that I just joined, and I'm going to make 1 stitch in pink. Then I can drop my pink yarn again and take up my red yarn. Then I'm going to make 7 stitches in red. Then I drop my red yarn again and look for the string that's directly underneath the stitch. So this one right here, lay it over my red yarn. Then I'm going to purl 1 stitch in pink, drop my pink yarn again and take up my red and finish the rest of the row. All right, so this is what it's going to look like once you've finished row 26. And now we are just going to continue our way up with these 4 strings of yarn that we have. And we are going to carry our red yarn all the way across from end to end. And I'm going to see you again for a row 32, because here we are going to have to catch a float since this is more than 4 stitches. And I'm going to show you how to do that there. All right, so this is my swatch up until row 31. And now we are going to do row 32. For me, it's a wrong side, so we are going to purl these stitches. And I'm going to show you exactly what to do to catch the red yarn here, where you have a longer section of pink stitches. We are once again starting our swatch with 2 knit stitches on the wrong side. So I'm just going to make 2 knit stitches right here. And then I'm going to do 3 more purl stitches. Then I'm going to drop my red yarn and pick up the pink yarn that's directly underneath the stitch. And now we are going to purl 3 stitches. So 1, 2, 3. And then we are going to catch our float. So this would be the red yarn that we have to carry all the way across this 5 pink stitches. But in order to catch it, we are going to take our pink yarn and we are going to wrap it once around the red yarn in order to incorporate it into our next stitch. Then we can take up our pink yarn again with the red yarn wrapped around. And then we can continue to make 2 more stitches with pink. And now we have to change back to the red yarn. So we are going to drop the pink yarn. Then we are simply going to take up our red yarn again that we have caught in our stitch here. And we have caught a float. And we have carried all the way across here. And now we can knit our stitches with red until we have to do the other stitches on the other side in pink. Here I did 8 stitches, and now I'm going to drop my red yarn and pick up the pink yarn from the stitch that is directly underneath, so right here. And then I'm going to knit 3 stitches. And then I'm going to once again wrap my pink yarn around the red yarn to catch our float. And then we are going to do 2 more stitches in pink. Then we can switch back to the red yarn we carried all the way across and purl the rest of the row, except for the last 2 stitches, of course. And this is how you catch a float. We have now reached the final row of our Intarsia bow, and we can start our row by knitting 6 stitches in red. Then we are going to drop the red yarn, pick up the pink yarn that we used in the previous row, that's from the stitch directly underneath, and then we are going to do 3 stitches in pink. Then we can switch back to our red yarn, and we don't have to catch any floats here because it's only 3 stitches. I'm going to continue all the way to the other side, where I'm also going to knit 3 stitches in pink. Once again, I'm going to drop the red yarn, pick up my pink yarn that I used in the previous row. Then I'm going to knit 3 stitches in pink, drop my pink yarn, pick up my red yarn on top, and I'm going to finish knitting my row. This is what our swatch is looking like right now. And now we can continue with our red yarn, just doing 4 more rows, 2 purl and 2 knit rows. And then we are going to finish off our swatch by doing 2 knit rows at the end. This is what your swatch is going to look like once you've finished your 4 additional rows and the 2 knit rows for the garter stitch border. And now we are going to turn our work to the wrong side, and we are going to knit this row since we are still doing the garter stitch edge. Now we are going to bind off our stitches to finish our swatch. I'm going to knit the first stitch and also knit the second one, and then I'm going to bring the first stitch that I knit over the second one that's on the needle to bind it off. And I'm going to continue like this, binding off my stitches. All the way until the end. Once the last stitch is bound off, you can just cut the yarn and pull your loop through, and there you have your finished swatch. Now that you're done with your swatch, you can see you have a lot of loose ends that you need to weave in. If you are a little bit more lazy like I was with this swatch here, you can just weave your stitches in a little bit and let the ends hang out as normal. You don't have to weave the ends in all the way. I would, however, recommend you guys to weave in your ends at least a little bit, since we have so many loose starts and beginnings, and these stitches are always going to be a little bit looser, but we want to have the same even stitch tension all across our swatch. So do the lazy method if you want to. You don't have to weave it in all the way, but weave your stitches in at least a little bit so you can measure your gauge swatch better later on. Now the only thing remaining, except for weaving in your stitches, is blocking the swatch. And that's exactly what we are going to do with this swatch right now. All right, here we have our finished swatch. All that's left to do is wait for our swatch to dry. I just put this swatch into a little bit of water with some wool detergent, let it soak for about 30 minutes, and then I took it out, put it in a towel and pressed out all the water. And now I pinned it down on my board with some pins and I'm waiting to let it dry. Once your swatch is dry, you can start counting your stitches. You are going to apply your ruler and measure how many stitches you have across and how many rows you have going up in your 10 centimeter window. And with that, the tutorial is complete. I really hope you had a great time creating the swatch, and I hope I didn't discourage you from trying out any new Intarsia projects. If you are interested in the Bikini Slipover pattern, we are going to link it down in the description below. If you have any questions, any comments, any concerns, please always feel free to send us a message on Instagram or leave a comment down below. We promise we will try to answer as fast as we can. Other than that, I'll wish you a great day and maybe I'll see you soon. Bye!